Hi, I'm Mike Ebert, and we're talking today with Mike Licona, who is a New Testament historian with the North American Mission Board. And Mike, we've been talking about evidences for Jesus' resurrection, and you've talked about a couple of theories out there that maybe 100 years ago scholars thought held some credence. The hoax theory that Jesus' body was removed from the tomb and then hidden maybe. The apparent death theory that he really didn't die. That accounts for why Jesus appeared to the disciples and the others. But those have been largely discredited now. What are some alternate hypotheses and theories, though, that do still hold up and that some scholars still believe may account for the resurrection?
Well, perhaps the most popular one today is the hallucination theory. That is that Jesus' disciples were grief-stricken, and so shortly after his death they were confused and in grief, and so they experienced hallucinations of the risen Jesus. But this was popular 150 years ago. It's been in disrepute with scholars for some time until recently it has experienced a resurgence. But it suffers from many of the same problems it did 100 years ago, and now with what we know from modern psychology, it has even more problems. So for example, modern psychology has revealed that there are multiple modes in which hallucinations can be experienced. And I'm getting this information from one of the most recent comprehensive works on the subject, and that is a book titled Hallucinations, The Science of Idiosyncratic Perception, written by Ehlman and Lahra'i and published in 2008 by the American Psychological Association. And the modes in which we typically experience hallucinations would be audio, where you hear something that isn't really there, or visual, you see something that isn't really there, or you feel touched by something that isn't really there. That's called a tactile hallucination. A kinesthetic hallucination, where you feel like you're in motion. You know, like when you wake up because you felt like you were falling off a cliff or off of a building. Right. That's called a kinesthetic hallucination. Or an olfactory hallucination, where you smell something that isn't there, or a gustatory hallucination, you taste something that isn't there. So hallucinations are experienced in these modes. Now, people usually experience hallucinations in a single mode rather than multiple modes, like seeing and hearing something, except in the case of drug inducements, drug addiction. Then people will experience it in multi-modes typically, and in some other cases as well, but mainly with the exception of drug addiction or drugs. So here's what we have when we come to the disciples' experience in it. Okay, they all experienced visual hallucinations, because the earliest reports say in 1 Corinthians chapter 15, verses 3 through 7, which virtually all scholars who studied the subject say that this is an oral tradition that predates Paul's writings, and that Paul got it from probably the Jerusalem apostles. So it's going back to the eyewitnesses themselves. So this is really, really early and eyewitness testimony. So it's all visual. He appeared to Peter, then he appeared to the 12, then to more than 500 at one time, then to James, then to all the apostles, and then last of all, Paul says he appeared to him. So it's all appearing. So what are the chances that all of these people, if they're going to experience hallucinations, that they're going to do so in a visual sense, and then they're going to experience the same content? It's not going to be the Jewish or Roman guards coming to get them, which, if they were fearful after the crucifixion of Jesus, that could very well be a reason or the content of their hallucination. But no, they didn't experience that hallucination of that. They all experienced it of the risen Jesus. And we also know that hallucinations and group appearances, group hallucinations are extremely rare, if not impossible. And so you'd be looking at not one, but 3 group hallucinations, to the 12, to more than 500, and to all the apostles, which makes it very, very, very rare. So, you know, when you put all of that together, and plus the skeptic, the church persecutor Paul, it's very unlikely that he would experience a hallucination, because he's not grieving. He's glad Jesus is dead. He's wanting to dispel of the Christian cult, which he sees as a Jewish heresy. and feels called of God to do this as a zealous Jew. And so he's not going to be grieving Jesus' death. He's glad Jesus died and he wants to see the church destroyed. So the hallucination theory accounts for very little. In fact, just one more thing about that. The highest, according to Ehrman and Lorai and other studies, the group that experiences the highest percentage of hallucinations, their members, would be senior adults bereaving the loss of a loved one. And in multiple studies, about 50% on average experience a hallucination of their deceased loved one. Most of those, 39%, is a sense of presence. They don't see them, they don't hear them. It's a sense of presence that they're in the room, okay? That's 39% of the 50%. So basically 20% of all bereaving senior adults. Only 14% of those 50% experienced a visual hallucination of their deceased loved one, or 7% of all bereaving senior adults. So if that's the highest group, then how likely is it that, since the disciples are not senior adults, they're probably pretty young guys in their late teens, early 20s, that not 7% of them, but 100% of them experience visual hallucinations with the same content many times simultaneously, and that the content was such of nature that they all thought that they were experiencing the same, having the same experience.
Right.
The probabilities of these are just astronomically low. And so you can see why the hallucination theory doesn't work well at all.
Yeah, that one seems pretty easy to dismiss. Are there others that, though, are maybe currently in vogue with more scholars that are a little tougher to dismiss? Or?
I don't think so. There's another one called the metaphor hypothesis, put forth by people like John Dominic Crossan of the Jesus Seminar, Marcus Borg, his colleague, and some others. It was more popular a couple decades ago. It's still popular among some today to say that they went to the scriptures, they saw justification to believe that God had vindicated Jesus as he would all the righteous martyrs, and that Jesus had been taken to heaven. If they experienced any kind of appearances, they were visions, they were dreams. They wouldn't have thought that Jesus was raised in a bodily sense, and that they used the term resurrection as a metaphor for Jesus' continuing power and presence and peace within the church. Mm-hmm. So again, there's a few scholars who would say that today, but that is crazy as well. A few problems with that is they have to misinterpret several of Paul's letters. Like, for example, a major passage is 1 Corinthians 15:44, where it says that when it's talking about the resurrection body, it says the body that we have now is sown a physical body and raised a spiritual body. Well, when you translate it physical, spiritual, it sounds like material, immaterial. And that's the way a few translations, like the Revised Standard Version and the Amplified Bible, and I think the New Jerusalem, that last one, have translated. But that's a mistranslation. I've done a word study on those two Greek terms for natural or physical and spiritual. And spiritual can be translated as immaterial, but it can be translated a number of other ways as well. But the killer of that argument is the term that's translated physical. And most English translations render it as natural. It's the term psychikos, and it appears just shy of 850 times from the 8th century BC through the 3rd century after Christ. And on no occasions is that ever translated. Does it mean physical? Which means that's a poor translation there. When you look at Paul's writings elsewhere, he's pretty clear in my judgment that he's meaning physical bodily resurrection. So you've got that problem. But another problem with the metaphor is Paul linked the future resurrection of all believers, himself and all believers, on whether Jesus rose from the dead. Christ is the first fruits of those who sleep. Of the believers who have died, and that we will all be raised. Christ raised, around the year 30, and then the rest at Jesus' second coming. So if you're just going to use it as a metaphor for Jesus' continuing power and presence, then that gives us no hope for resurrection. Obviously, Paul, if he's going to base our future resurrection on Jesus' resurrection, it couldn't have been a metaphor. And Paul was very clear that if Christ has not been raised, because of all the suffering that Christians have to go through, especially back in that first century and even in many countries today, with all the suffering they go through, if Christianity is a false religion, then we're of all men to be pitied and we're fools. So yeah, it's not a metaphor. And one other thing I would add is if the Christians meant it as a metaphor, then why is it that when all the skeptics, the opponents of Christianity, like Celsus, like others report, that they're responding to a physical resurrection? That's the way they understood the Christians. And the Christians had every opportunity to respond by saying, no, you misunderstand. We don't mean physical resurrection. But no, instead, they defended physical resurrection. So everything points to the Christians proclaiming the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus, and not that it was being used as some metaphor for Jesus' continuing power and presence in the church.
Now, Mike, what about those who would just say, okay, I've looked at the evidence and I've heard the case that history makes for the resurrection of Christ, but there's just not enough, it doesn't add up for me?
Well, I'd say to them, this is why historical method is so important. It does reveal the strengths and the weaknesses in a hypothesis. And historians are responsible for going with the most probable explanation. And when we take the facts, the historical bedrock, we don't even have to consider the empty tomb, we don't have to consider the appearance to James, or all these other things, that the second tier facts, you could say, and just look at the historical bedrock, those facts that are so strongly evidenced that it is those facts have persuaded virtually all scholars who are studying the subject, a heterogeneous group of scholars, to grant them as historical facts. You say, well, what do we do with these? And when you follow the criteria for the best, or the inference to the best explanation, explanatory scope, explanatory power, plausibility, less ad hoc, the resurrection hypothesis wins. It explains all those facts. It explains them without forcing them to fit. You don't have to improvise in any sense or add any non-evidenced assumptions. At most you could say, well, it assumes God exists, but that's far from being non-evidenced. And even if a person isn't convinced by the evidence for God's existence, that's still a long way from saying there's no evidence for it. And then finally, plausibility, that's the one that you could say, we're going to have problems wrapping our arms around here, because we know that people they're not raised from the dead by natural causes. But no one's really claiming Jesus was raised by natural causes. The claim is that God raised Jesus from the dead. And if God exists and wanted to raise Jesus, then there's no reason to believe that it's improbable in any sense. So I'd say you got to look at the evidence, go where the evidence leads. I think we do have enough evidence.